Good morning, everyone. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. And welcome back to another segment of our Quarantined Catholic Hub. Today we're going to be looking at the Mass readings for Thursday, May 21st. Now this day is actually Ascension Thursday, but because the readings are moved on the Ascension to Sunday, we're going to be looking at the weekday readings for today. And in fact, what I'd like to do is focus in on the first reading today. It's from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. And today's gospel might be entitled something like A Day in the Life of St. Paul, because it gives us a little snapshot, a brief sketch of what it must have been like to be with Paul on the road, traveling as a missionary and trying to extend the borders of the kingdom of God in the ancient world. It tells us a little bit about some of the friendships that he made, some of the converts that he made, and it also tells us about some of the opposition that he faced, right? Some of the hardships that he had to overcome, some of the hurdles that were there in front of the gospel that Paul had to find a way, with God's help, to overcome. Now, this particular reading from Acts 18, verses 1 to 8, appears in Paul's second missionary journey. Now, if you know anything about the book of Acts, if you've read it before, you know that Paul takes 4 great journeys in the book of Acts. 3 of them are missionary tours, and then he has a final journey, an adventure, if you will, to Rome at the end of the book. So this occurs on Paul's second missionary journey, and that puts him around 50 or 51 AD. We're in the early 50s of the first century. All right? And Paul has just been at the great capital of Athens, that great center in the Greek world, center of intellectual learning and philosophy and thought. And Paul had limited success there preaching the gospel, especially because he mentioned the resurrection in Acts. But now he makes his way to Corinth, which is in the southern part of Greece. It's on the little land bridge, or the isthmus, that extends off the southern mainland of Greece. And the city of Corinth will become a really important one in Paul's ministry. As a matter of fact, Paul wrote at least 3 letters to the Corinthians. 2 of them appear in our New Testament, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So this is a community that Paul is actually founding. Paul was the pioneer evangelist, the first to go into Corinth to announce the good news of Jesus in the synagogues and to begin winning converts to Christ. All right, bringing people to faith in Jesus as the Messiah and the divine Son of God come among us. Now, let's begin reading in Acts 18, verses 1 and 2. Luke says this. Luke is the author of the Acts of the Apostles. Luke says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them." So first thing is that this appears to be Paul's first encounter with this extraordinary couple, this husband and wife team, Aquila and Priscilla. Okay? They will actually play a part elsewhere in the New Testament as well. It's the beginning here, though, of a long relationship that this couple had with the Apostle Paul. And they are a Jewish Christian couple. All right? They're identified as Jews, but they've obviously come to faith in Jesus, and they were just expelled from the city of Rome. So they were driven east, and they find themselves in Corinth. Now, we know that they were co-workers of Paul for many years, because after Paul ministers to them and labors alongside them in Corinth, we see that he actually takes them with him when he goes to Ephesus. And then he leaves Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. And then several years later, we hear about in Paul's letter to the Romans, in Romans chapter 16, that apparently the couple made their way back eventually to Rome itself once again, because Paul sends them greetings in Romans 16 at the very end of the letter. And one of the things I really like about Aquila and Priscilla is that it reminds us of something that we as Catholics sometimes refer to as the universal call to holiness. This is something that the Second Vatican Council was emphasizing. The universal call to holiness is a call that goes out to all of God's people. In other words, it's not just bishops and priests and deacons who are called to share the faith with others, who are called to spread the gospel to the world, but literally all of us as baptized believers who are prophets, priests, and kings in Jesus Christ have a responsibility and a part to play in bringing the good news to the world around us. And I think Aquila and Priscilla help to remind us of that. They're just a lowly Jewish Christian couple, and yet here they are laboring alongside an apostle. They are people that he obviously trusted. He even says in Romans that they risked their life for him at one point. We don't know what the circumstances were, but they were committed as a Christian couple, committed to their Christian calling. Now, something else, he says that, Luke says that they came to Corinth from Rome because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, we actually know about this historically from other sources. It's known as the Edict of Claudius. And the Edict of Claudius is probably datable to about AD 49. We are told about it also in the writings of the Roman historian Suetonius in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, that apparently, as the story goes, and they're kind of sketchy on some of the finer details, but there were disturbances in the city of Rome, in fact, in the Jewish community in Rome, the synagogue community in Rome. There were upheavals and disturbances and arguments over a certain individual that Suetonius calls Christus, all right? And Christus is probably not the instigator of these troubles. He's not the troublemaker himself, but in fact, Christus is probably a reference to Christus, which is Christ himself. In other words, most historians would agree that the reason why there was upheaval in Rome, why it led Claudius to deal with this nuisance in the way that he did by driving them out of the city, all the Jews out of the city, is because there were probably disagreements in the Jewish synagogue community in Rome over the person of Jesus Christ. Is he the Messiah? Is he not the Messiah? Some people were saying yes, others were saying no. And so you have tension, you have conflict. And the Roman emperor was tired of it. He had had enough of it. And he said, it's time for you all to go. So in AD 49, he issued an edict that drove all the Jews out of Rome. And they were out of Rome for a little while, at least until the death of Claudius in AD 54. After that, it appears that the edict probably lapsed. And Jewish Christians and Jews who were non-Christians eventually made their way back to Rome again. That's why Aquila and Priscilla will be found in Rome again later on in like 57 or 58 when Paul writes his letter there. But that's a little bit about the historical background. Luke says, and because he, that is Paul, was of the same trade as Aquila and Priscilla, he stayed with them, and they worked together, for by trade they were tent makers. And he argued in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks. Now, this is interesting because this is the only place in the New Testament where we learn something about Paul's occupation. St. Paul was a tradesman. St. Paul was a tent maker, all right? And apparently Aquila and Priscilla were as well, and so they went into business together, all right? And so when we think of the Apostle Paul, it's important to remember that on the one hand, Paul was a scholar. He was a man of books, a man of great learning. In Galatians, he tells us that he exceeded all of his peers in studying and embracing and learning the traditions of Judaism, the traditions of his fathers. But Paul was more than just a scholar. He wasn't an ivory tower type of figure. He was also a traveler and a missionary, somebody who wanted to take the gospel out to the world. Right? It wasn't bookish knowledge. This was knowledge that was supposed to change people's lives wherever they were found. All right? But now we learn something else. Paul was not just a man of books or even just a missionary. He was a man who worked with his hands. He was a manual laborer. All right. And there's a reason for this. Paul actually tells us in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, two of his earliest letters, he tells us that he did this very deliberately. He didn't want to burden the earliest Christian communities by accepting their support. He wanted to be self-sufficient. He wanted to support himself with his own trade, and this is something that the rabbis generally did in the ancient world. In addition to being spiritual leaders, they also had sort of a manual labor type job. They also wanted to make money, all right? And Paul did this very deliberately. Even though he had a right to be supported by the community, because Jesus said that the laborer is worthy of his hire, even still, Paul wanted to remove every possible obstacle to people's acceptance of the gospel. And so he wanted to work with his hands. He didn't want to be supported by them. He wanted to support himself and simply be among them with the good news. And this, I think, reminds us of what is the other side of the universal call of holiness. If the universal call of holiness is a call to bring the gospel to the world, to help sanctify the world wherever people are at, there's also the other side, which is we are to be sanctified in our work. And it doesn't matter what kind of work that is, whether you're a seamstress or somebody who builds houses or a refuse collector or a scholar. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that God can be brought into every occupation to sanctify it. You can, by being the best seamstress you can be, by being the best contractor you can be, you can honor God and be sanctified and become more holy in the course of that work. So I think that's a reminder for us today as we look at St. Paul and we look at Aquila and Priscilla, is that our mission is to be, one, sanctified in our work, by doing even the simplest things, like working our trades and using the gifts that God has given us. But then also the other side is sharing the good news and being a faithful witness to the gospel so that the world itself can be sanctified beyond us. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope that God blesses you and your day, and we'll see you here next time. Thanks.